you, Professor de Moraes, for being with us today with Aspire magazine. We have this occasion to ask you a few questions for the benefit of our students, our staff, and even our future students, perhaps. I know that you are quite a name in leadership roles, leadership skills. How did you get here? Sort of, can you tell us something about your past, something quite general, which would tell us something about yourself, basically?
Well, leadership is always, very important for me since I was very young. Coming from Brazil, I started, working very early in my life. So I was exposed to leadership, when I was a teenager, basically. My first full-time job, I was 13 years old, and even when I teach, my students, when I tell my students about this, they are very surprised, because it's not very common in Europe, especially in England, to have, a full-time job at the age of 13, 14 years old. But that was my time, back to the 1980s, in my home country. So I was exposed, to leadership from the beginning, and eventually, I started studying leadership, and I used leadership in my master's level, and then eventually, into the PhD level as well. So I'm very, very interested in this topic or subject because leadership is about everything. Sometimes people think that you cannot teach leadership, but you can teach. I always prove this to my students, either to undergraduate level to towards executive level. You can change the mentality of people when they learn more about leadership, because leadership is everywhere. Leadership is the first thing I teach actually about leadership is first we need to think about ourselves. And one of the first books that I present to my students on, or first thoughts from not just this first book but other my own ideas, is first I need to develop myself, leadership. And actually when I was in my 20s and I started to develop really myself, then I became even more close to the subject of leadership. So this was transformed into 2 dissertations basically, and eventually a book that is coming up very soon.
Impressive, quite impressive actually. And to go back to work, a lot of our students are faced with this dilemma of filling up a curriculum vitae, and they know that they have to be very proper in the way that they formulate their CV. And one of the main points in a CV would be leadership skills.
Yes.
What is that about? What should they write? Sort of, could you give them a couple of hints?
Of course. Many students, they think that leadership is only at the top level.
Exactly.
That's the first thing, we need to understand, and to let these students know that leadership becomes from the bottom rather than from the top. Of course, when you talk about politics, and I'm going to talk about this evening, actually, a little bit about, of course, we always think that we need to expect leadership from the top. That's wrong.
An automatic reaction.
Yeah, leadership comes from the bottom, and leadership, starts from your home and along, towards, your in the society. What I would recommend to my students is to do volunteer work. It's very uncommon especially to some cultures. For example,
Western cultures mainly.
To be honest with you, I found more difficult, or not more difficult, more challenging, to talk about volunteer work with Asian culture. Even though in Japan, things are changing, quite well, with young people, but with Chinese students, for example, when you talk about doing volunteer work, for them it's okay, but why this is important for my CV, and actually, multinational corporations are, paying attention to this, and it's very important, when you have some volunteer work. Another thing is to do, for example, a year gap, after you finish your degree, and do some volunteer work, and travel around the world, and I think you can acquire so much skills, leadership skills, when you do this. One of the best books I have read, and I read hundreds of thousands of books on leadership, and I have all these books with me, and some of the ideas around, is one of the best books I read on leadership actually was not written by an academic. It was written by a gentleman called Joe Owen. You can buy this book, at the airports, actually, because it's so easy, to understand. And the whole book, is based on his own non-profit organization. And this non-profit organization is teachfirst.org, which is a British organization, non-profit. And what Joe says is that if you want to acquire leadership skills, this is more specific for undergraduate students, you should teach primary and secondary school. So it's very, you say, well, wait a minute, so for me to become a professional and a very successful executive and understand leadership, I should teach. Well, he says yes, and he proved to his research, over 700, young people who went through teachfirst.org, that if they teach 2 years primary school or secondary school, and by the way, you can do this, also in a volunteer basis. You don't need to do full time. Just a few hours a week, for example, and you can acquire so much leadership skills. Learning from the children, because he says if you are able to manage a group of kids in the classroom,
around the kids,
then
you can do anything.
You can do anything in the adult
It does
world.
make sense. It does make sense.
And I love this, and it's true, because when I go actually in my philanthropy side, that I go to schools, in my home country, Brazil, and also in England, and I go and I talk to the kids, it is absolutely true. You learn so much about leadership skills, from children. And this is what I'm saying, that leadership does not come from the top, it comes from the bottom.
So true.
Yes.
So true. That was extremely interesting indeed. A perspective which I never really, I had thought about it, but I didn't think that it was so already structured. Another thing, let's go to the top now. Some of our students, our BBAs mainly, are aiming to become managers, having their own companies perhaps in the future. So being a leader does start from the bottom, but ultimately being a leader up there and having so much to take care of, so much to think about, how can you, the question would be something like, how can you manage a company and be a good leader at the same time? Because sometimes you would end up sort of at contradictory roles. You want to be a good leader, but at the same time you want to make money, and sometimes that doesn't. Those are loggerheads. Are you understanding the question?
Is there anything, so yeah, I do understand, and let me try to rephrase this, with two questions, So first of all, is there anything wrong about making money? No, my opinion. There isn't anything wrong about making money. Even though some of my colleagues actually they disagree with me, because they say that if you work, for a non-profit organization, you should not think about making money. Nevertheless, we have to understand that most of the best non-profit organizations are funded by entrepreneurs who make a lot of money, and some of them are excellent leaders as well. So this is the first question. So the second question then is, how can I, and as you just rephrasing your own words, how can I relate leadership with this idea of being a manager? Yeah, and actually there is lots of discussions and research about. So is there any difference between management and leadership? Well, actually, I can say to you that you might be a good leader without much management skills. Yes, you might be a very good leader without management skills. And especially in the political world, you can see this. However, to become a great leader without much management skills, you have to surround yourself with good managers. And this is exactly what's happening in some, countries, for example, in some of the political world, basically. Back to my home country, for example, in Brazil, the previous president, a great leader, is still, a very good leader. Unfortunately, now it's with cancer, unfortunately, but a very good leader. Was he, a great manager? No, he was not a great manager, but he was always surrounded by good managers. And I don't know if you realize, if you go through some of the biographies of these great entrepreneurs, for example, Richard Branson. See, you can see that they choose, very good brains to work with them. They have the leadership skills, and they have good brains to work on the management side. Because question that I always ask my students when I present, Richard Branson, a very famous British entrepreneur and also around the world, how can he deal with over 200 companies? That's what the Virgin Group is over 200 companies. Is he a good manager? Actually, no. He's a very good leader, to manage managers. Having said that, however, when you are talking about our students, especially young people, who are here with us studying management, his leadership is important. Yes, it is so important that to become a very successful manager, you need leadership skills. So you see, the difference is that you might be a good leader, but you need managers around you, to deal with your business. But what about if you have both? Isn't that better? I always teach, my students say, you see, when you study management and you understand leadership, you can be a very successful manager in whatever level you are. If it's your own small enterprise, or that you start, or if eventually you become a CEO of a very large corporation.
That's brilliant. Leadership and negotiation. That negotiation basically is part of life. It's part of everything. So we start negotiating from the moment we're babies.
Yes.
But obviously there's a big difference, huge difference between that type of negotiation and at other levels, political, business, etc. Is it an important part of leadership?
Negotiation.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
In what way?
Absolutely. No, it's very important. In fact, it's one of the main skills for a good leader is to be able to negotiate. The question is, how can I learn how to improve my negotiating skills? And perhaps that's what we need to teach more our students in the classroom, so they can apply outside. Negotiation skills is extremely important for a leader. But once I understand myself and I understand what leadership is for me and for those around me, then I can learn more about how to negotiate. Because it depends on the situation, isn't it?
Exactly.
Because as a leader, for example, we have to understand that I can change. I can change my negotiation skills. It depends on the group.
You adapt to who you have in front of you.
To whom I am talking with, isn't it? Because obviously that if I'm talking to, let's say that, I'll give you an example. I was doing some volunteer work, not long ago in Africa, in Kenya, yes, and I was in a very remote and very poor area of the country, on the border of Somalia, for example. It's obviously that the negotiation skills that I was using at that time with those gentlemen or ladies and gentlemen, around that area cannot be the same when I am in the city in central London, isn't it? It's completely different. So I have to adapt myself, to the environment and to the group of people that I am talking with. It depends on the situation. It's the same as you mentioned, about we learn, since we were children. Yes, it's the same. If your negotiation skills, that you deal with, with your children, for example, or in the classroom, maybe not the same as when you are negotiating with your employees. Yes. For me, it's very important, to understand, and that's what we call situational leadership. Actually, all part of situational leadership. So yes, negotiation skills is extremely important when you want to become a great leader. But we have to understand, that it depends on the level and it depends on the situation.
Is it necessary for leadership though? Does a leader need to be a good negotiator?
Absolutely. And negotiation skills is extremely important for anyone who wants to become a successful leader.
I think my students our students will love to hear that one already.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
A last little question, and we'll be closing this very interesting interview. One quote from yourself: effective leadership is not about making, it is about creating. Something which struck me, indeed, sort of, there's a lot behind it. Could you care to just give me a bit of what's between the lines?
I can elaborate a bit more on this. Yeah. I don't believe that you can make leaders. You can create leaders. Yes. And how do you create leaders? First of all, as I said, before, we need to understand ourselves. And great leaders, they create other leaders to follow them. Because in any situation in our lives, and that's what I say to my students, every day you are either a follower or you are a leader. In different situations. For example, we are under the government regulations and we have a president or a prime minister, so therefore they are our national leaders. Yes? But then I come here and I have my own business, so I am the leader, I am the business owner, so it's now I am in a different position. So but back to my quotation on creating leaders, is because I believe that you cannot make someone to do something. You can help this person, and as I said before, first of all you need to help yourself to create something. Yeah? I need to create my life. I need to understand the reason for me to be in this planet. What is the purpose of my life, and so therefore I can create my life, around myself, and what do I want to do in the next few decades in my life. For example, I am a middle-aged man, so I did some calculations. If you go on my website, you'll see I did some calculations about how many hours we live in these planets, and we don't live many hours. We only live some thousands of hours, I don't know exactly the number now, but of the total amount that I did calculations based on an 82 years old male, for example, which is the average of male in England, for example. And so what I want to create out of this life, basically. Yeah? And the same, I need to talk with my students about this, as well as with my future employees when I become a manager, or when I teach my students, that they are future managers, basically. So what do other people around them want to create for themselves? Because then when they understand what they want to create for themselves, then they can help me to create the best company in the world, or the best organization in the world. When we teach organizational change, for example, what is organizational change? It's about changing the organization, isn't it? It's changing the culture of the organization. But I can only teach and help my, in this case not the students, but in the work environment, to change an organization, to change the culture of an organization, when they understand what we want to create out of this organization, for example. Yes? And this is my understanding, basically. So we don't make things, we create things. And as if you can see around us, everything is about creation. If you are a believer and you believe in God, you believe that God created the world in 6 days, and then he or she rests in the 7th day. Yes? And around us, everything is about creation, isn't it? So actually creation becomes first, and then you make something. Creation starts in your mind. I want to create something. Imagine that one day someone decide to create this glass. Yeah. In order to create this glass, they study, they research about,
from a concept into an actual.
Yes, exactly. From a concept to conceptualization,
Physical.
Yeah, and physical, and so therefore the glass was made. Yes, but made through creation, which is starting our brain, in my opinion.
An extreme insightful observation, to tell you the truth. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for your time, Professor de Moraes. Did I pronounce your
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
correct, yeah.
It's been really insightful having you over here with us, and we really hope to see you again in Malta. And I think we are very lucky, our students are very lucky to have you over here tonight, having that seminar over at St. Martin's.
Thank you.
Thank
It's
you
my
so
pleasure
much.
to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.